Well, I've got a scholarly result to announce, provisionally anyway, which is that the extended mind thesis was first stated and was stated with supreme clarity in very much the same terms as the extended mind thesis came to be stated in the 90s by the American philosophers known as the New Realists, circa 1905. I'm talking about Ralph Barton Perry, William Pepperell Montague, and others. Now, I think that for my money, the extended mind thesis, usually associated with David Clark and, are these all Davids? Andy Clark and David Chalmers, is an extremely important result, it seemed like a complete reorientation of philosophy of mind or of the picture of the human when I ran across it in the 90s. I tried to contribute to the literature, and I did fairly early. I have a paper in philosophical studies from '95. That's a couple years before Clark and Chalmers. But I was reading Mark Rowland's on externalism. I didn't make this up. Nor did he, because, I don't think he knew this literature, and I didn't know this literature, and I didn't really quite grok this until recently, although I should have. It's hard, though, because these philosophers have been so buried. Who reads Ralph Barton Perry? All right. Now, let me try to state the extended mind thesis. It's funny, but there's, it's a little hard to find like super crisp statement of extended mind or externalism with regard to mental content or perceptual content. But here's how, this is how Clark and Chalmers defined it or characterized it roughly in 97. If, as we confront some task, a part of the world functions as a process which, were it done in the head, we would have no hesitation in recognizing as part of the cognitive process, then that part of the world is also, so we claim, part of the cognitive process. Or as some might put it, part of our mental content. Cognitive processes ain't all in the head. In these cases, the human organism is linked with an external entity in a two-way interaction, creating a coupled system that can be seen as a cognitive system in its own right. All the components in the system play an active causal role, and they jointly govern behavior in the same sort of way that cognition usually does. If we remove the external component, the system's behavioral competence will drop, just as it would if we remove part of its brain. Our thesis is that this sort of coupled process counts equally as well as a cognitive process, whether or not it's wholly in the head. So like maybe you remember with the aid of external objects like a calendar. Right? It's pretty mundane. This is the way I put it, I think, which is a little more technical. This is, again, like a reconstruction. My paper from 95, Radical Externalism Concerning Veridical Experience, was the most technical paper I've ever written. Had a bunch of logical notation in it. But I'm trying to reconstruct the basic position. In a case where one is experiencing an external object, there are no intrinsic or internal properties of the experiencer whatsoever which she displays in virtue of experiencing that object, of a sort which are necessary for her to have that experience and which are epistemically accessible to her. Or as I put it, all properties of a person which she displays in virtue of experiencing an external object and which are epistemically available to her with reference to the existence and properties of that object are aspects under which her experiential relation is fully fused to that object. Fusion being a technical, logical, I shouldn't even have done that. Now, when Clark and Chalmers go to say what the history of that idea is, they do it pretty sketchy, man. Clark likes to attribute, early versions or whatever to Vygotsky, the Soviet psychologist, and mentions Heidegger, and then his work in the 90s, that was, or 80s even, that was moving in this direction, by neurologists and psychologists. Mark Rowlands says he got it out of Sartre, sort of, or that Sartre anticipated it. Yes, and maybe so. Maybe Heidegger and Sartre had something. Pretty obscure though, because but that's interesting. No one's really tried to peel back the history, or people maybe assume that there can't really be a history that runs very deep. But the American realists of the early 20th century whipped this shit out. All right, they really did, man. And the reason why they had externalism and the kind of radical realism that goes with it, metaphysical realism, perceptual realism, and anti-representationalism, is because they were trying to stomp on idealism once and for all and bury that sucker in a shallow grave. 1903 was the moment that all over the world people were going like G.E. Moore, as well as all these people were going like, are we going to do another century of German idealism? Because that shit is whack. Anti-scientific. Incomprehensible. Etc. Rationally arbitrary. A complete betrayal of human experience of the world. Completely incompatible with like Darwinism and shit. Like we need a new role. We need to roll in a new direction. All right. In my view, I read this paper at SAP last week, Society for the Advancement of American Philosophy, and now I'm just going to, roll through it briefly. In my view, the extended mind thesis, or externalism with regard to mental content, is one of the most striking and fundamental results in philosophy of the last half century. One way to think about it, many mental states, including typical sense perceptions, cannot be designated or individuated successfully without appealing to facts outside the person having them. Mental states are not all internal to the person having them. They have external objects and other persons as fundamental, identifying, indispensable, or essential elements. Or what I'm seeing when I see, to use an example from J.L. Austin, a pig, is that pig itself, not a patch on my visual field, a sense datum, or an idea. We reason, remember, analyze, using portions of the world as parts of our consciousness or intelligence. The calendar on the wall or on the phone, the shelf of books and snapshots is part of my memory, continuous with it, as it were. Extended mind provides a picture of human beings, qua epistemic agents, as continuous with our environments, embedded in them, and of perception and other object-oriented mental processes as fully engaged modes of participation in the world. This position has become something like the common wisdom in AI and robotics. Above all, it's a cure, even at this late date, for modern philosophy, with its attempts to derive knowledge from the pure syntax of ideas. A multi-century mistake. In my formulation, or Clark's, or Perry's, Ralph Barton Perry that is, I'm going to post some handouts that I did with this and some documentation. I'll give you the sources in some form. I really will. In my formulation, or Clark's, or Perry's, in a veridical experience, an experience that informs you truly about the world, The things one is experiencing cannot be specified, picked out, or distinguished from other things without appeal to facts outside the head of the experiencer. We are in some sense fused to our environments, which are in some respects are parts of our minds as well, parts that we share with one another. We are the world. The day the music died. The extended mind thesis was first clearly stated and systematically developed by early 20th century American philosophers known as the New Realists. Oh darn, where's my book? My New Realist book. They published a collaborative manifesto in 1910, the New Realism. So I'm saying that they first stated the extended mind thesis, and it was continued in psychologists influenced by them, directly influenced by them, such as James J. Gibson and his ecological psychology. And this all strikes me as pretty remarkable. This seemingly counterintuitive, or at least counter-philosophical consensus position, which arrived in philosophy of mind in the 1990s with a thunderclap, and also changed a lot of research programs in cognitive science and artificial intelligence, was the unanimous common sense, ultra clearly stated, of Hartley Burr Alexander, Ralph Barton Perry, Walter Marvin, and E.B. Holt, Edward Bassell Holt. Forgotten figures. Somewhat undeservedly. The pragmatists cleared the field of them, really. They were early kind of pragmatist critics or a pragmatism alternative. Now, the extended mind thesis, sometimes referred to by these figures as the relational theory of consciousness, is conceived by them to be the very opposite of philosophical idealism, although extreme opposites can approach each other in certain respects. And 1903, we might say, was the moment that the whole world came to think that German idealism was unsustainable or merely ridiculous, anti-scientific, I already did this, I guess, rationally arbitrary, grotesquely incomprehensible, and so on. At that same moment, as the American New Realists were well aware, G.E. Moore was saying, "I refute it thus," and waving his hand. Like, here's something that's not in the mind, it's a hand. Not only did they say it first, the extended mind thesis, unless you count Song Dynasty Neo-Confucians, but I think that with suitable but minimal adjustments to the then current jargon, the statements of extended mind by the American realists are as clear and as explicit as it's possible to be, and in some respects more developed than the current literature. Although I need to really read all the current literature, I guess. Now, we should trace the origins of the view of extended mind theory to the reading of Perry and others of late William James. Perry was James's student and colleague, first his student and then his colleague at Harvard, and edited a collection of late papers and published it, posthumously for James in 1912 under the title Essays in Radical Empiricism. He had certainly known these papers much earlier, as James had placed them on reserve for his courses, and most of them had already been published. I mean, Perry was taking courses with William James and George Santayana and Josiah Royce. Must be nice. Perry later won a Pulitzer for his biography of James, which is a hell of a thing, that 2 large volume biography of William James, the life and character, thought and character of William James. A number of the papers in the posthumous collection, Essays in Radical Empiricism, seemed to Perry and Holt, also James's student and colleague, to move in this direction, the extended mind direction or radical realist direction. These essays amount to some extremely bold forays into the philosophy of mind, the essays in radical empiricism, well past or contradictory of some of James's earlier psychology in particular. In particular, the realists were profoundly influenced by their reading of James's papers, Does Consciousness Exist? No, he hints. Not as a thing, not as a single thing, as a relation. The Thing and Its Relations, that was another paper, brief one, and How Two Minds Can Know One Thing. Papers by James. Late papers by James. A key sentence in the last of these, How Two Minds Can Know One Thing, says that when we call an experience conscious, that does not mean that it's suffused throughout with a peculiar modality of being, psychic being, as stained glass may be suffused with light, but rather that it stands in certain determinate relations to other portions of experience extraneous to itself. Perry saw James as beginning to diverge from pragmatism altogether by the end of his life. This has got to be really controversial, like in a group like SAP, where people account themselves often pragmatists and William James fanatics, maybe, or fans. This would be very controversial. In his preface to Essays in Radical Empiricism, Ralph Barton Perry says that James's developing point of view, quote, makes it possible to escape the vicious disjunctions that have thus far baffled philosophy, such disjunctions as those between consciousness and physical nature, between thought and its objects, between one mind and another, and between one thing and another. I'm not pronouncing here on whether they were right about James. Perhaps not, though no philosophers ever had better access to James's person and papers than Perry and Holt. But the position they drew from late James is fascinating, whether or not it can be attributed to the man himself. In his biography of James, Perry is explicitly critical of James's idea of a world of pure experience, as put forward in the Essays in Radical Empiricism, as obscuring his actual positions. Quote, it was difficult for James's readers to realize that he had abandoned idealism and construed experience as a larger area within which the boundaries of consciousness and self can be defined. For this misunderstanding, he was himself largely to blame. He was a recent convert from idealism and lapsed readily into its habits of speech. Nor did he ever become perfectly clear in his own mind on the crucial issue between idealism and realism, the status, namely, of those parts of nature that lie beyond the mental reach of man, and whether there are any such things. So he reads the James of radical empiricism as a transitional figure, unable to quite clearly state the realism he was driving at, with its new conception of consciousness. Perry and Holt regarded their project as the completion of James's. So that's how we got to externalism for the first time, unless it's Song Dynasty Neo-Confucianists. Now let's turn to some of the fundamental statements of the extended mind thesis by the New Realists. As I say, the first statement I can find, the first clear statement I can find, is from Hartley Burr Alexander, a really interesting figure. He was at Columbia with a bunch of these figures, or a bunch of the New Realists, but he spent most of his career out in Nebraska and stuff like this, developing the iconographic program for the Nebraska State Capitol. Things like this. He was not one of the original 6 realists, New Realists, but he recently finished his PhD at Columbia, where the New Realists, such as Montague, were his contemporaries, probably his professors, although they might have been fellow students. No, Montague would have been his professor. Montague would have just come from studying at Harvard. This is Hartley Burr Alexander. Nice writer, too. We learn in our physiologies that the brain is the seat of consciousness, and taking this figure to mean that the mind must somehow be enclosed within the brain, we accept the solution as sufficient unto our need. If we stop to think what consciousness itself may be like, we are apt to imagine a pallid vapor, hovering as a halo about the head or permeating the pores of the brain. If we inquire more narrowly concerning the nature of its content, we dream vaguely of thoughts and feelings and diaphanous images and are satisfied. Should anyone suggest that the things we feel and touch, things of sensation and perception, are also but the stuff of dreams? At first we scoff, but as the argument from the machinery of sense is pushed home, gradually we yield. For it never occurs to us to question the premise that consciousness is confined within the skull. But it's not. And entertain this to be a scientific, not some mystical assertion. Here's Alexander's teacher from the following year. I don't know who got this first in the seminar or whatever, but these are the early statements that I can find of extended mind. So this is William Pepperell Montague from 1905. All relations presuppose the existence of the terms between which they subsist. If consciousness is at length to submit of the same scientific treatment that we accord to other phenomena, if it is to be equated to a mode of relation between things, as physics is coming up saying that things are characterized by their relations, relativity, it must inevitably be regarded as secondary to those things, consciousness. Consciousness, in short, must be thought of as inhering in its objects. Consciousness, in short, must be thought of as inhering in its objects, rather than its objects inhering in it. If the world of concretely perceived facts is real, consciousness must be a relation between them. And the world of concretely perceived facts is real. What a radical position, I guess. Here's Ralph Barton Perry from Present Philosophical Tendencies, his first book. That's a very unprepossessing title, isn't it? Present Philosophical Tendencies. Mental content consists of portions of the surrounding environment illumined by the actions of the organism. Mental content consists of portions of the surrounding environment. Finally, a mind embraces certain contents or parts of the environment. It is customary to look for content within the body and then solemnly declare that it is not to be found. Though long since theoretically discredited, the subcutaneous mind still haunts the imagination of everyone who deals with this problem. But why not look for the object where it belongs and where it is easily accessible, namely in the environment? Is it not in truth the environment which the amoeba or any organism is sensing? If then we are in search of content, why take so much pain to turn our backs on it and look for it where by definition it must escape us? In a private world. Has a little Wittgenstein private language too, man. Like this is a public world that we share, or it's nothing. And here's yet another Colombian and New Realist, quite unknown person really, Walter Marvin, in a first book of metaphysics from 1912. Consciousness is not usually in the body. My consciousness of this page is literally this page. The page in certain relations. That is, a field of consciousness is a certain cross-section, a certain collection of entities belonging to the universe of subsistent entities and definable as a group by its peculiar relation to our bodily reactions. Now, I think these are as clear as any formulations in the current literature, and that they are roughly equivalent or quite identical to the recent theories. That is, I think we need to directly attribute extended mind to Alexander Perry, Montague, Marvin, and Holt. Furthermore, they expanded on their externalism in a way that is also reflected in the recent literature on extended mind. They centralized the social aspects. So first, they used the basic insight to solve the problem of skepticism about other minds, which these psychologically oriented philosophers, several of whom were actually trying to study other minds in laboratories, could hardly fail to recognize as a scandal and a challenge, the skepticism about other minds. If one can't answer skepticism about other minds, Holt exclaims over and over, Edward Bussell Holt, one can't defend psychology at all. Indeed, Holt believed that in order to treat psychological difficulties, one would have to know what was in the mind of the patient. He thought that he himself, and all of us really, do that sort of thing routinely. But he saw that philosophy that separated the world into objects and the ideas of those objects, that is, more or less all modern philosophy, ended you up not only in idealism, but in solipsism. The notion that each of us is locked in the theater of his own images, or have no access to anything external to her own consciousness, makes the science of psychology impossible. Indeed, it undermines all science, which makes modern philosophy's emergence simultaneously with science puzzling, or comprehensible primarily as an anti-scientific reaction. That's the way I read most of modern philosophy, actually. Certainly Kant, for instance. The social aspects of externalism were emphasized by all these figures, but were, as I say, most central to E.B. Holt's work. Here's a canonical formulation of extended mind from his 1914 book, The Concept of Consciousness, encompassing both the physical and the social environments. Quote, now, since the process of cognition assuredly involves both a knower and a known, a subject and an object, it is implied that an individual mind, witnessing acts of cognition in order to describe the process, can include both the subject and the object, other subjects and objects that are shared in perception, can watch the changes in both. A psychologist, for example, can watch the subject and the environment. That is, other minds or parts of them, and objects or parts of them must be included within an individual mind. The individual mind of the psychologist, or this whole thing is not going to work out at all. Certainly one cannot describe the cognitive process who cannot witness it. Now, can one mind contain parts of other minds? This is Holt continuing. And then, can it contain objects? Can a mind contain parts of other minds? And can it contain objects? That a mind contains objects of some sort, ideas maybe, is admitted, but that it can contain either the whole or parts of another mind is generally denied. Works on psychology unfailingly state that every consciousness is completely shut off from every other. No mind and no part of one can be in any other mind. Individual minds are mutually isolated. If this is true, the proposed task of psychology in explaining cognition cannot be accomplished. Upon higher planes of intercourse, Perry had written, in narrative, in straightforward and companionable discussion, another's mind consists more of objects than anything else. What a remarkable thing to say. A sentence only an externalist could love. Another's mind consists more of objects than anything else. But as we sit in the same room, for example, your mind and my mind share many of the same objects. We are having an experience of the very same things in the very same place. Who would deny that? But hundreds of years of philosophy. If the contents of our minds are subjective ideas or images, we cannot and do not experience the same objects. But we do experience the same objects. Therefore, what we are experiencing is not our ideas. One man's modus ponens is another's modus tollens. This is a rather striking way to say that we share a world. Now, we know that. It's sad that philosophers made all these problems about it, but now we're back in our bodies. Thanks to Edward Bussell Holt. Indeed, this social externalism is also proving to be an incredibly rich underpinning for psychological and cognitive research. In her popularization, The Extended Mind, The Power to Think Outside the Brain, Annie Murphy Paul finds herself most intrigued by the way the position opens up the reality of social connection and even collective subjectivities. Quote from Annie Murphy Paul. As early as that initial paper, Clark hinted that other kinds of extensions were possible. What about socially extended cognition? He and Chalmers asked. Could my mental states be partly constituted by the states of others? Could my mental states be partly constituted by the states of others? We see no reason why not, but they didn't really go down that road all the way. But consider me a convert, Paul says at that point. But Perry and Holt were there long before Clark and Chalmers. Edward Gleason Spalding, one of the original New Realists and one of the most interesting, drew the direct implications for ethics of the radical notion that our minds overlap. Quote, the field of morals is very generally admitted to coincide with that realm in which there are human beings or personalities as they stand in various relations, not only to one another, but also to other living creatures and even to all nature and the universe itself. So first of all, ethics requires realism. That's what he's saying right there. There has to be a realm in which there are human beings or personalities as they stand in various relations to one another, outside of your imagination that they do so or whatever. And also, and that's a nice ethical insight for 1917, in Spalding's book, The New Rationalism, that the whole universe and other creatures, etc., are implicated in our ethical situation. Really a radical and right position at that moment, God. What now? The moral situation. The moral situation seems therefore to occur only under specific conditions. This is a situational view of value, or even a situational view of moral responsibility. These are central doctrines of my book, Entanglements, A System of Philosophy. And I didn't realize, as I wrote that, the situational account of value, my situational account of value, extended mine, right, that they were there first. The identity theory of truth as well. What now is the topography of this realm, the moral realm, the situation? It is only when the human individual reacts in a very specific way, namely when the personality of other individuals, and accordingly their desires, motives, rights, and ideals, are in his field of consciousness, and his and theirs, that the moral situation subsists and exists. There's got to be human minds in interchange, okay, through human bodies. The apparent radicalness of this situationist account of ethics is again belied by the fact that it is a close restatement of what we all know perfectly well. Facts such as that you and I are both real, and that we can get to know one another. It's a tribute to the effectiveness and perversity of modern philosophy, reaching its culmination in idealism, that it renders such commonplaces outlandish, and perhaps managed to suppress this criticism for a century. Right? So like I said, I think the New Realists, they got kind of suppressed. The pragmatists won the argument and cleared the field of them. Of course, then the pragmatists lost to the analytics, who cleared the field of them. So intellectual history might have more to do with academic politics than with the survival of the best ideas. So buried were these ideas that even though I'm sort of a specialist in some of this history, I missed it, kind of, All right, I guess that's my thing today. Maybe I'll do some more philosophy lectures. Now I'm no longer teaching, which is weird.